Hello there dudes, and welcome to this third part of the Jumpstart mini-series, and we're going to be talking about conditional logic, specifically the if-else statement and the for loop and the while loop, and then two special kinds of for loop. It's pretty good fun, it's fairly interesting, so let's get stuck in, and I'm going to start by entering some of the code where we left off. Only take a second. We just need to get the basics up and running, so bear with me a minute just while I type some of this in. So we need the CSS styling for the elements as we used in tutorials 1 and 2. So that's the styling that we're going to be using. So it's just centering the header on screen, centering the paragraph text, and also the loop examples are going to be given a colour. So we just need to enter the HTML. So we've got some elements to update the inner HTML text so that we can see the results of our loops and if statements on the screen, similar to how we did before, where we just override the default text that we initially put in for the elements. So let's just enter the header tag and the four paragraphs that we're going to be using. So I'll just put those in now. So we're going to have span elements as well within the 4 paragraph lines that we're using for the loops, and that is because the first line of the for loops and the while loop, we want to have them a different colour, so we can give the span its own class called loop examples, and then we can set that colour as we please, and then for each additional line that gets added onto the inner HTML within the loops, the text for the additional lines will be a different colour, so it'll just make the headings for the loops stand out against the rest of the text. And now I'll just add the 2 lines that we used for the first 2 tutorials so we can get something up on screen. So I'll just put those in now. But I'll just comment this line because I forgot to click save. I'm going to comment both of these lines actually, and then I'm going to click save. So I'll click save now, and there we have the different lines of text. The colour's a bit off there with the green. Just make that a bit darker. Yeah, a bit brighter. That's better. Oh, that's okay. So we can see the 4 paragraph elements, the 5 paragraph elements I should say, and we can see line 1 there. So let's now uncomment the first line just like we did in the first 2 tutorials. Click save. Nothing happened. No errors. I've got 2 closed body tags. Let's click save again now. Still didn't work. Uncaught type error, cannot read in HTML. We've got an extra greater than symbol in there, so let's try again. There we go. So that's what that line does. You've already seen this before if you've watched the first 2 tutorials, and we've replaced the text of line 1. Now we need to get stuck into the actual conditional logic. So we'll start with the if statement. So now we need to create the 5 variables for the 5 paragraphs that the getElementById function call. It returns an object, so we're going to assign that object to a variable name. Let's type in those variable names now. Line 1 equals document.getElementById, and so unlike the first 2 lines, we just leave those as they are. That is the object being returned by the function call being stored in line 1, and then we can edit line 1 as we please. So I'm going to do that same. I'll just copy the line and do the same thing for the others. That's that done, and now we need to get into the really exciting part. Let's create a random number. Now, this is something that we're going to look at in the maths tutorial, which is the 5th one. This is the 3rd one. But for now, just to make things more interesting, let's just create a random number. I'll just show you what we need to do to get a random number. So let's choose a variable name, and we call the random function of the math object of JavaScript. We do that like this. It's the math object, access its random function. We'll be looking at this in much more detail in the final tutorial. Now, I would say it's going to be interesting at this point if we use the console log function. I think we've used this before. Let's display in the console the results of the random number. And just look over here on the right, within this window here, I'm going to go back and click save. So we should see a random number appearing there. There we go. Let's just widen this actually, see if this works instead. There we go. Okay, so we've got a random number, and now we need to do something with an if statement. To declare an if statement, we use the keyword if, and then within the parentheses or round brackets as we call them in the UK, or at least I call them, we can do anything we want. We can check a condition. So let's say if the random number is greater than 50, then we'll do something. And then within the curly braces block of code, we can change something. So let's change, and this will get interesting in a minute. So let's just edit the text in line 1. Now what that should do is whenever we resave the document, if the random number that's generated is greater than 50, actually it's not the random number that's going to be greater than 50, it's going to be the random number after we've multiplied it by 100, because the random number function returns a number from 0 up until just below 1, so from 0 to 0.999999. I'm going to click save now, and that's because if you look over in the console window, you can see the number is 23.65. So I'll keep clicking save, and as that number changes on the right, if it doesn't go above 50, nothing will change in the middle. When it does go above 50, this has replaced line 1 will change to this number is greater than 50, with the number appearing first before the colon. So I'm just going to click save now. There we go, 93.197. I'm going to do it again, and we can see that line 1's text has changed. So let's just click save again. There we go, it's back below 50 again, below, above. That's the if statement working correctly. So let's now do something for when it's less than 50. This is probably not surprising. If it's greater than 50, we're going to do what we've just done, else we're going to do something else. So let's change it to give a different message. And now let's run that, and we should see the message appearing accordingly, depending on whether the number is greater than 50 or whether it's less than or equals to 50. So I'm just going to click save. So it's above 50, above 50, still above 50, still above 50, below 50. This number is less than or equal to 50. So this is the second message being displayed now. And if we keep doing this fast, we can see the message. Yep, you don't need to look at the number in the console window because the number is appearing in the center panel. So let's now create our first for loop. So we type in the for keyword, and then within the round brackets we have three things. The first thing is a variable that we're going to increment each iteration of the loop. We've got a variable called count, and we're going to set it to start at value 0. The next thing we need to have is the condition that needs to be true for the for loop to continue running. So the condition that we want to be true can be anything we want. So let's say whilst count is less than 5, and then the third thing we put in the for loop is to increment the count variable. So we can do that with the ++ operator. Those are the three things in the for loop declaration: the count variable, the condition, count being less than 5, and then what we're going to do with the count variable. So we're going to increase it by 1 every iteration of the loop. And then within the block of code, we can put what we want to happen. That piece of code there, less than sign, br space / greater than sign, that causes HTML to start a new line. So that's why we're putting that in there. Otherwise, all of the text that the for loop generates as it cycles through will just appear in one big long continuous joined together line. So this will keep them as separate lines. And if you remember that I said we were going to colour the for loop example, while loop example in green, we've done that now by this bit of styling just here. That's how we've coloured this first span, so the span within this section here. And now any additional text that we put on within each of those loops won't be green, because that green only applies to the span. Let's continue here. So hopefully when we run that, we'll see the for loop example text just here. We should see that change. So I'm going to click save now. There we go. So we've got 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's 5 different iterations of the loop. So let's now look at the while loop. Again, the while keyword. Now this is kind of similar in a way, but only so similar. We need to declare another variable as well. Within the for loop, we declare the count variable within the opening declaration of the for loop. So it's one of the 3 things that we mentioned. We don't have that situation in a while loop, so we need to declare the variable before the while loop. Let's create a variable called times, and you'll see why I'm calling it times in a moment, and start that at 0. And we can do the same thing. This time we'll just do 3 iterations of a loop. The condition that we want within the while loop, and there's only the one thing that we put in the while loop, as long as times is less than 3. That's everything for the declaration. And now we need to just put in there what we want to happen. But we also need to increment the times variable, just like we do in the for loop just here, where we've got ++ count. We need to do that within the while loop. So we'll do that, but it's obviously times. And now we can do what we just did, but we'll need to change that line a little bit. So we're going to change that to line 3. And now if we run that, we should hopefully see the while loop produce 3 lines. So I'm just going to click save now, and it has. This isn't right though, is it? 1 time is correct. 2 time it should be with an S on. If we put the S on there, that's wrong for 1 time. Let's delete the S. And let's do something slightly cunning. Let's add the S on only based on a certain condition. So this is more conditional logic now. Another if statement, but the if statement is within the while loop this time. So if times is greater than 0, so if it's greater than 0, we can add a letter S on the end. Sorry. And line 3 again. You can see why that should fix it, because we're going through the loop, we're not adding the S on in the main line of text, the first line of text, but we are going to add the S on if times is greater than 0. So that if statement should skip the first iteration of the while loop. So I'm just going to click save now. That didn't work. Sorry, I got that completely wrong. It's if the times variable is greater than 1, not greater than 0. There we go. So we can see that it's 1 time, 2 times, 3 times. The reason that it's greater than 1, not greater than 0, that was a mistake, is because... So we'll just go through the exact logic of why I made that mistake. I think it's because I put ++ times above the line 3.inner.html. I think if it's below, we'll see. Times starts out at 0, then it increases to 1, then we display the text, and then I was saying if times is greater than 0, add the s on. Well, it will be. I've just increased it. It's the first thing I did in the while loop was increase it, so that's why that didn't work. If I put that back to 0 and click save again, you'll see it's gone wrong again. So now I'm going to just cut that, and if it's greater than 0, and as we can see that also works. The reason that that's working now, just follow it through again, is because times starts out at 0. The first line is written without the s. If times is greater than 0, well, it isn't because it's still at 0 because we haven't increased it yet, so the s isn't added on. Then times is increased at the very end, so that's what we want. So we can do it both ways. We can have it so that it's greater than 0 or greater than 1, and the difference is where we put the ++ times, either after or before. That's one of those things that can catch you out ever so easy, like he did me. This next part are the 2 special kinds of for loop that JavaScript has. So we've got a for in loop and a for of loop. We're going to need to, and they basically loop through arrays or objects and similar things, but there is a fundamental difference between the two. So I'm just going to now type in an array and an object. So there's our array. Let's create an object next. So that's the array and the object that we're going to be looping through. So let's start with the for in loop. So let's compare this for loop with the declaration of this for loop. We can see there's a big difference. We know what we did in the first for loop. We declared a variable, we set the condition, and then we incremented the variable value. We're declaring a variable again, x compared to count, but then we use the in keyword and we specify the variable, in this case my object, that we're going to be looping through. Let's change the value of line 4, and then I'll go into a little bit more detail about exactly what it's doing. So what happens with the for in loop is it returns the property name within the object. So the property names within my object are vehicle, make, model and kilograms. For each iteration of the for in loop, it returns one of those names in order from top to bottom. X will be the variable that we've declared that becomes equal to those names. If you recall on the second tutorial, there are various ways to access values within an object. One of them is to use dot notation, and another way is to type the name of the object and then within square brackets put the name of the key. That's exactly what we're doing just there, with X becoming the property name. So we're going to display the property name, then a colon, then a little space, and then we're going to put the property value next to it. So let's save that and see what happens. And there we go. So we've got vehicle, car, make, Ford, model, Mustang, GTV8, kilograms, 1743. And we're going to now look at the for of loop, and then I'll show you something interesting about how the two compare to each other. Now the for of loop doesn't attempt to look for a property name and the associated value. Instead, it just directly reads the values from the array. which makes sense because the array hasn't got a property name, which is why the for of loop is so well suited for things such as arrays. I'll just click save now, and we've got an error. Why have we got an error? I didn't change the ID when I copy and pasted earlier. Hopefully that'll fix it, so let's resave it. There we go. Like I say, the for of loop just accesses the values directly. It doesn't bother looking for a property name or a key associated with a value. Now we can do some tests, so let's try and let's change the first one that's looping through an object. Let's change that to an of loop as well, and now let's see what happens if we click save. We get an error and it says my object is not iterable, and I think that's because an object being a more complex structure, because it's got a property name and a property value, you can't just simply choose to select both of those things as one thing, which is basically what you're trying to do with an of loop. Now on the other hand, let's change that back. If we now change the of loop to a for in loop going through the array, will we get an error or not? Let's click save now. No, we don't. But look, we get all 6 index positions instead. So how can we explain exactly why that is? Just like we tried to explain why we got an error with the changing the for in loop to a for of loop for the object. And it's because the for in loop is attempting to find a property name associated with a value, and we don't have any property names in the array, but instead of throwing an error, it treats the index positions of the array as if they were the property names, which kind of makes sense when you think about an array. You've got position 0 and then you've got a value. So those two things are kind of two separate things, just like the object property name and value are two separate things. Well, the array index position and value at that position are two separate things. But I'll just change that back. There we go. And that pretty much wraps everything up for this conditional logic tutorial. There are 2 more. The next one is going to be on functions, and then the final one is going to be where we make a maths quiz program, which is really fun. The next 2 are both really interesting, to be honest, so hopefully I'll see you next time. Don't forget to subscribe, and thank you for watching. Cheers.